off or whatever, because I know what happens after lunch. Then I'll know it's time to stop. You know, it's great to be here. It was a privilege for me a couple of months ago to have Mark come out to Arizona, and I got to introduce him to some of my friends and family and things, and he got to see kind of my neck of the woods and where I have my stomping ground. So it's great to be able to see where the Mecklers live and kind of their environment. So it's wonderful. Now I do want to talk a little bit more detail about that clarity of vision that Mark just referred to and how we get that clarity of vision. It's all about education. And it's about understanding not only our history, but understanding some of these fundamental principles that we have. See, we kind of had a rude awakening a couple of years ago. We woke up, what has it been, 2.5 years now, almost 3 years. America woke up, and we looked around, and we thought, we're not as free as our grandparents kind of indicated that this country is all about. And we got a little concerned, didn't we? And so we said, no big deal. We'll just tell Congress we want our freedoms back. How's that worked out for us? Congress doesn't want to give it up. And we learned this experience thousands of years ago. In 450 AD, the Anglo-Saxons came to the island of Britain. They're referred to as Anglos or Ingles. And so they went to the island of Britain, and it became known as Ingles land, or as we call it today, England, right? And this was the birth of people's law, or common law, on the island of Britain. And they had this beautiful system of government. There was a time when Kent had zero crime and zero poverty. And they just this great system of government. The only problem with their system of government is that they didn't write it down. So they didn't tell their leaders exactly what they could and couldn't do by writing it down. It was all just verbal. And the reason why they didn't write it down is because to them they were self-evident truths. And the young people today, how would they say self-evident? They use the term like it's a no-brainer, right? So for the Anglo-Saxons, it was a no-brainer that if you till the ground up and you plant some seed and you nurture that ground and whatever grows, whatever you harvest, you reap what you sow, right? To them, that was a no-brainer. What they didn't realize is that most politicians don't have brains. So you've got to write it down. And so what happened is in about 1066 AD, we had the Battle of Hastings when the Norman kings came in and conquered the Anglo-Saxon people and corrupted their system of government. And so then, about 1215 AD, they got so frustrated, those Anglo-Saxons, that they finally went ahead and put together, they took this big chart, and they wrote some of their rights on it, and called it the Magna Carta, and they brought it to the king, forced him to sign it, and the king didn't live by it, so they sent some of their best and brightest to go live with the king and be with the king, and that became the first English Parliament. And then as the years continue to progress, we end up having more and more things that these Anglo-Saxon people start doing. So as far as writing their rights down, so they write the Petition of Rights. They force King Charles to sign that. King Charles becomes so ruthless, they overthrow him and put Cromwell in charge. And then finally they end up putting King James in charge, and they overthrew him in the Glorious Revolution. And they said any king that wants to ascend to the throne has to sign the English Bill of Rights. And so William and Mary agreed to do that. And so they signed that English Bill of Rights in 1689. So I just brought you through a very, very fast history of England to illustrate some very important points. First of all, from 1066 to 1689, we've got about 600 years there. Once you lose your freedoms, very difficult to get that back. Very difficult to get that back. And you have to write things down. You see, the Anglo-Saxons didn't write it down, and so they started writing it down. Started getting 600 years, they've just barely gotten a fraction of their freedoms back. And that's kind of what we're experiencing now today. We're only almost 3 years into what I hope is not 600 years. But nevertheless, it's difficult. So we've got to be very concerned that we try to get the freedoms back that we've lost, but even more so, we can't lose any more. Very difficult to get them back once we lose them. And there's only one way that we're going to be able to do that. It's important that we pay attention to Congress and elect good people and all that, but all of those things are temporary. The only way we will have lasting change in America is through education. In fact, Thomas Jefferson once said that the only true corrective to constitutional abuses is education. On another occasion, he said, "Enlighten the people, and tyranny and oppression will vanish like evil spirits at the dawn of day." So we've got to educate the people. Now, we used to educate our people quite well through most of the 1800s, even early part of the 1900s. In fact, there's a fantastic story that used to be in every single school textbook prior to 1934. And it's this great story that took place in 1755 at the Battle of Monongahela. In the Battle of Monongahela, we find a young lieutenant colonel who was serving in the British Army by the name of George Washington. And he was there, and General Braddock was the one in charge of the regiment that they were going up and fighting in the French and Indian War. And they were fighting in the normal British tradition, where you've got these bright red uniforms. You're in this line, and so you had about 1,000 men that were marching down this forest road that were clearly seen by the soldiers that were in the Indian warriors and the French soldiers who were practicing guerrilla warfare. So they could clearly see those British dressed in their bright red uniforms marching shoulder to shoulder, 1,000 of them. And you've got them waiting to basically just be chopped to the ground. And sure enough, the battle ensued. And bullets started riddling the forest. The smoke filled the forest, round after round, bullet after bullet. And the soldiers or the officers tried to keep their men in formation. Even as the Indian warriors shot them one by one, they tried to keep organized, and they couldn't. George Washington was the only officer that was able to somewhat keep people organized. And he had 2 horses shot from underneath him. And he mounted those horses that had been left idle by the death of fellow officers. And he kept having bullets shooting around him until finally, some of the Indians that were trying to shoot him, the Indian chief told them to stop trying to even shoot him, because the Great Spirit, that Indian chief said, protects that man. One of the Indian warriors said, "I had 17 clear shots at that man, and after all, none could bring him to the ground. That man was not born to be killed by the bullet." And so George Washington, later on that afternoon, he gathered all the remaining soldiers, and they retreated. And later that evening, he noticed an odd tear in his coat. He took his coat off, and there were 4 bullet holes in his jacket, but not one single wound did he have on his body. In fact, in his long military career, George Washington was never even wounded in battle, but yet he was often found on the front lines in those battles. Now, what's interesting about this story, George Washington reflected upon this often in his life. He talked about it in a number of his speeches and letters and things. And like I said, it was in every school textbook up until 1934. Well, the very interesting part of the story is 15 years later, after this battle, in 1770, George Washington was in the western frontier, and the Indian chief that was in that battle heard that he was coming. And so he traveled a great distance to meet with him. And he sat down around a council fire with his warriors and with George Washington and those that were traveling with him. And he began to talk. And he began to tell his warriors, "Look at this great warrior. I first saw him when the white man's blood mingled with the streams of our forest in the great battle of Monongahela." And he said, "Pay attention to this man." He said, "There's something that protects him. The Great Spirit protects him." And he said, "There's something that bids me to speak in the voice of prophecy. Listen, the Great Spirit protects that man, and will one day be hailed as a great leader and father of a great nation." And he went on to continue to kind of explain this and prophesy who George Washington would be. Of course, we know the history from there. Isn't that a great story? It comes from our American history. And our history is riddled with stories like that. And we used to teach our kids these things. But we also used to teach our kids about principles, about fundamental principles. Things like losing your freedoms. Very difficult to get them back once you gain those freedoms. We used to teach them about principles of property. and life and liberty and so many important other things. And so the only way that we will be able to correct this great nation is if we correct the problems that we have caused in our education. And I'm not talking about schools. That's definitely an area that we need to fix, absolutely. I'm talking about the education that you and I offer to our children and our grandchildren. We just don't do this anymore in our society like we used to. And we've got to start doing it. Because if you're going to have any kind of lasting change, we've got to begin teaching our young ones. So again, it's not schools that I'm really talking about. We do need to try to help those as much as possible, but that's not really where real education happens. Mark kind of briefly told you a little bit about this experience we had at Harvard. And there was a gentleman by the name of Ralph, how do you pronounce his last name? Banco? Ralph Banco. He's a columnist for like Forbes magazine and some other stuff. Anyway, we were walking to dinner one evening, and somebody was following us because they were asking me some questions about the Constitution, this and that. And finally, after that gentleman was done and he was walking off, Ralph turns to me. Now, Ralph considers himself part of the Washington elite. He's a self-described Washington elitist. But he also likes to joke about his friends, and he makes fun of them because he tells them, he says, you guys think that you're these elitists and you know more than the masses. You guys are a bunch of idiots, really. The masses know far more than you. So even though he considers himself that part of that circle, he also considers himself, a Tea Party patriot, grassroots kind of guy. Anyway, so we're walking to dinner, and he said, Bill, what's your background? Do you have a degree in constitutional law? Do you teach? I mean, what? I said, no, I'm just a construction worker. My brother and I own a contracting company in Arizona, and that's what I do for work. He said, oh, that's great. He said, just stick it to all these lawyers and these elitists that think they're so educated. And I said, no, Ralph. It's far better than that. I'm not only not a college professor or anything, I said, I'm a high school dropout construction worker. and he's like, oh, that's fantastic. Because here we are at Harvard, and when I gave the speech that I gave at Harvard, it was an amazing experience. First of all, speak in a building that was built back in the early 1700s. To speak from the same pulpit that some of our founding fathers would have spoken from. So it's very humbling. But I was the only one out of 20 some odd speakers that spoke about fundamental natural law principles. Out of all these constitutional minds, I was the only one speaking about natural law principles. And afterwards, so many of them came up to me and said, Bill, that's interesting stuff. That's just my work. But those are things that I've never considered before. They kept saying that over and over. I've never considered that. In fact, the next morning when we were at the NBC studios when Mark and Larry Lussick were going to be on the air, Larry's sitting in the green room with me, and he said, Bill, I've been thinking about some of the things that you were talking about. They just might work. I said, I never considered those things. So they've never considered natural law principles because they don't teach that in law school anymore. They don't teach that in our school. So when I'm talking about education, I'm talking about personal education and education in our homes. And I'm talking because that's really where this kind of thing is going to be taught. Fundamental principles that allow our children to build upon a foundation that does not exist anymore. It does not exist right now. So we've got to rebuild that foundation. If we do that, then we can finally have lasting change in this country. And it might take us 100 years. It's taken them 100 years to destroy the Constitution. It might take us 100 years to get back. And as long as we resolve in our own minds that may be the case, then we can finally be at peace with that and realize this fight is not for us. Many of the things that we're fighting for today, you and I won't really see the effects of. But we're doing it for our children and our grandchildren. And we have an absolute duty to do that for them because our ancestors did it for us. All the way from that Battle of Hastings in 1066, when our ancestors lost their freedoms, and they sacrificed and died and lost so much for 600 years to try to gain it back. And then when they came to this country, and as Professor Chenard, the great historian, said that the revolution was not anything, trying to create any new ideas.